While the majority of the fighting in Africa during the Second World War occurred in North Africa, it was by no means limited to that part of the continent, and most other African states contributed to the war in one way or another. Largely, this was because many of them were under the thumb of European rule, but some African states were independent. Today, we're going to provide you with an overview of just 3 of the most important African states of the war. Despite its white population accounting for just a tiny fraction of the Belgian Congo's 12 million strong population, the state was firmly under Belgian control when World War II broke out. As it would turn out, this was bad news for the Belgian Congo's African population, but good news for the Allies overall. Even though the Germans absolutely steamrolled Belgium in May 1940, the Belgian Congo was pretty much forced to remain a belligerent under the Belgian government in exile. Basically, if the Belgian Congo had decided to sit this one out, the British would have invaded the state, fearing its resources would end up in Axis hands. In the words of white Belgian Minister of the Colonies, Albert de Vliechauer, the Belgian Congo has entered the service of the Allies. There is no hesitation whatsoever when it comes to sacrificing riches in favor of the war effort. But where might these riches have come from? The answer is through the production of uranium, copper, tin, manganese, zinc, wolfram, lumber, rubber, palm oil, fiber, and cotton, among other raw materials. And while the Belgian Congo had plenty of it all, ripping out the planet and shipping it to the Allies was a battle in itself. To keep up with the war's insatiable demand, the state almost doubled its mining force from 25,000 to 49,000, and everyone had to work harder, which certainly turned some smiles upside down. As for the Belgian Congo's uranium, the Americans found it particularly mouthwatering, and in September 1944, the Belgian Congo agreed to sell it to them at a fixed price. The Americans bought tons of the stuff, using it to create none other than the nuclear bombs they dropped on a most unfortunate Japan about a year later. Raw materials weren't the Belgian Congo's only contribution to the Allied cause, however. Thousands of soldiers of the Congo, both African and European, perished in combat during the war. Side by side with the troops from Rwanda or Urundi, most of these men operated under the Force Publique, which grew to include some 40,000 soldiers by 1943 and served in Africa, Madagascar, the Middle East, and even overseas in Burma. Of note in Africa was the Force Publique's contribution to the East African campaign, in which they won the surrender of 9 Italian generals, over 370 Italian officers, and over 4,100 Italian troops. In Burma, some 370 military medical workers from the Belgian Congo were attached to the British 11th East Africa Infantry Division, a unit comprised of troops from throughout Africa. As you may have expected, many native Congolese didn't want to be there rotting in the jungle. In the words of Congolese war veteran Albert Kunyaku Ngoma, "We were like slaves because it was Belgium that brought us into this war. We could not say anything." The same might be said for Kenya, albeit about the British instead. Known officially as the Colony and Protectorate of Kenya, British Kenya was dragged into the war abreast the Empire in September 1939. Kenya's contribution to the Allied cause, however, was a little different to the Congo's. Hands down, British Kenya supplied the British with the 2 most important wartime commodities of all, tobacco and tea. And to meet these demands, some 200,000 native Kenyan labourers went to work on various Kenyan farms throughout the war. Though while tobacco and tea certainly aren't laughing matters, Kenya's other greatest contribution to the Allied cause was flesh and blood. In 1939, the King's African Rifles, or KAR, boasted a measly 2,900 troops. By the end of the war, the unit was comprised of 43 battalions, to which British Kenya contributed some 30% of the manpower. To reiterate, more than 98,000 Kenyans enlisted in the KAR during the war, serving in British Kenya itself, elsewhere in Africa, in Madagascar, and also in Burma. In the early stages of the war, the British anticipated an Italian invasion of Kenya out of Italian East Africa, and while the Italian army never stormed Kenya en masse, there was some action, and a smaller Italian force even managed to penetrate around 100 kilometers into Kenya. Due in part to Kenya's strategic location, the state was also used as one of the major staging grounds from which the Allies brought the fight back to the Italians in East Africa in 1940 and early 1941. Bordering the Indian Ocean, the waters of southeast Kenya also hosted the British Eastern Fleet for a time. While not of native African heritage, British Kenyan-born Sergeant Nigel Grey Leakey served under the KAR in the war, receiving a posthumous Victoria Cross for his bravery and sacrifice in Ethiopia in May 1941. Like something out of fiction, Leakey leaped upon an Italian tank, opened the turret, and let loose with his revolver, killing everyone inside except the driver. Holding him at gunpoint, Leakey then forced the driver to steer the tank to cover. After Leakey had returned to his unit, he tried the very same thing again but was shot dead in the process. Lastly, it's important to note that many Italian soldiers captured in the East African campaign were held in POW facilities in British Kenya. While the Congo and Kenya were under foreign thumbs, South Africa was an independent British Commonwealth state. Still, like other Commonwealth states, South Africa followed Britain into war in September 1939. The nation's contributions were vital to the Allied cause. Like the Belgian Congo, South Africa's raw material production helped to keep the Allies in the fight. Of note were its coal, iron, steel, platinum, magnesium, and uranium contributions. However, the nation also manufactured considerable amounts of war material. At the start of the war, the South African army was tiny, composed of just over 5,300 regulars. This number was blown out of the water during the war, with some 334,000 men volunteering to fight for South Africa and her allies. Only about 2/3 of these men were armed, however, as the nation's racial policies would only let the military put guns in the hands of their white soldiers. Black and so-called coloured military personnel served primarily as labourers and transport drivers. Regardless, South African soldiers bled for the Allied cause all throughout Africa, most notably in the East African Campaign, during which they fought abreast the KAR into Italian-held Ethiopia. The North African Campaign, during which 10,000 were captured by the Italians, and Madagascar, which they helped liberate from the Vichy French. It was South Africa's contribution to the war in the sky that receives the most attention, however. A fair few South African pilots flew under the wing of the British Royal Air Force, serving with distinction in the Battle of Britain and other aerial engagements. But the South African Air Force, or SAAF, got stuck into the flight too. SAF pilots served just about everywhere, including over local waters, elsewhere in Africa and in Madagascar, though also in Italy, Greece, France, Poland, the Balkans, Yugoslavia and the Atlantic. Under the British Commonwealth Joint Air Training Scheme, or GATS, South Africa did her allies a solid by establishing 38 new air schools inside South Africa. Under the JATS, more than 33,000 Allied Air Force crewmen were trained throughout the war. Lastly, South Africa's ports and harbours were of great importance to the British Royal Navy, and South African naval forces assisted the Brits in defending local waters, notably the Cape Sea route. Here, South African vessels undertook coastal patrols, mine clearance operations, and anti-submarine ops. They also undertook similar operations in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asian theatres, while also assisting in evac operations and busting Axis subs. Setting aside the complex socio-political climates of the Belgian Congo, British Kenya, and South Africa during the Second World War, it's possible the outcome of the conflict would have been very different without their various contributions. But what do you think? Do you agree with our list? Or is there another African nation we overlooked? Let us know all that and more in the comments below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.